Herkese selamlar. Bugün iOS Developer Olmak serisinin 3. gününe devam ediyoruz. Başlamadan önce bir önceki gün neler yaptık ve bugün neler yapacağız bunlardan kısaca bahsedeceğim. Bir önceki gün böyle bir layout oluşturduk. Bir kart tasarımı yaptık. Kart e, oluşturduk. Bu layout'u oluştururken işte V stack'leri, Z stack'leri ve H stack'leri bir arada nasıl kullanırız bunları gördük. Aynı zamanda bu Apple'ın sembollerini ve emojilerini nasıl kullanabiliriz? Bunları gördük. E, Böyle bir kart tasarımı yaptık yani. Şimdiki bugün ise neler yapacağız? Bugün de e, Starting the War Card Game ve Swift Functions adlı lesson'ları bitirmeye çalışacağız. Toplam yine yaklaşık 1 saatlik bir içerik var. Yine 1,5 hızda izleyeceğimizi varsayarsak yaklaşık bu videoda 1 saat falan olacak. Şunu biraz düşürelim. Şimdi başlayalım.
Stuck on something, just visit codecrew.codewithchris.com. In the next lesson, we are going to build an app that is not just the user interface, but also includes app logic and user interaction. So it's going to be a good one. I'll see you there. Today, you're starting a brand new app that will teach you all of the basic skills for iOS app development. In this lesson, you're going to be building the user interface for that app. And then in the following lessons, I'm going to take you through the coding part so that you can add the logic and user interactivity to the app. Now, hopefully you've been following since lesson 1. And if you've been learning a lot, please show your appreciation by giving this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing so that you don't miss the next lesson. All right, buckle up. Let's go. Okay, let's go ahead and start a new Xcode project. Go to File, New, and let's choose Project. And then under iOS, we are going to select App. Now, by this time, this should start feeling pretty familiar to you. I'm going to call this the War Card Game. Now, this time, we are going to come back to this project over several lessons. So make sure you name it something that you like and also save it in a location that you can remember because you're going to need to launch this project again. So you don't need to change anything with team, organization, identifier. Interface should still be Swift UI and language should still be Swift. You don't need to check any of the other options. Let's click next. I'm going to save it on my desktop so it's easy to find. You don't need to create a Git repository for this. Let's just hit create. And if you don't know what any of those options are, I would suggest you review lesson 2 because that's where we went through all of those options. Let me adjust this window just a little bit so we can see what's going on. And I'll shrink that a little bit and we will actually get rid of that inspector tab. Next, we're going to add the image assets that we're going to need for this war card game. So I've got the assets ready to go here in this folder. In the video description below, you'll find a link to a war card game image assets.zip file. If you unzip it, you'll see the same image assets. Now, if you're on desktop,
Bunu bir indirelim hemen. War Card Game. Nerede göremedim ya. Resource and Downloads'ta sanırım. Yapma ya.
desktop, you might need to expand the video description that's underneath the title in order to see the link. And if you're on mobile watching this on YouTube, you might need to tap on the title of the video to open up the video description, and then you can find the link. Once you have that zip file unzipped and you have all these assets staring back at you, I want you to highlight all of them. Notice that they're organized by folder, and those folders are going to be preserved when we bring them into our asset library. So in Xcode, let's go ahead and click on assets. And then back here, we're going to drag this and just drop it in there. You're going to see that this is preserved. And so it's really nicely organized. And if you've worked with iOS app development before, you might have seen that we did 3 different file sizes. However, these images, if you notice, they are SVG format. This is a special vector format where you can scale up and down these image assets without any loss of quality. So that's really neat. And we only need to have this one size here. Okay, after you've done that, let's take a look at the UI that we're trying to build. Now, based on what you've learned in the previous lesson, how would you break this user interface up in terms of what view containers or layout containers, if you want to call them that, which one of those are you going to use to lay out these elements? And second of all, which view elements are you going to use to represent each of these things that you see? Now, as an exercise, I want you to pause this video and try building this UI yourself inside Xcode. Trust me, by doing this exercise, you are going to cement your skills and you're going to identify what you need to review. Now, before you start this challenge, if you haven't watched the previous lesson, you can do so right over there. Really neat, and we only need to, you can skip.
Bunları direkt assets kısmına atmamız gerekiyor sanırım. Ctrl A yapıp buradan böyle yüklesem oluyormuş, tamam. İyi, güzel, hızlı oldu. Ben bayağı e-mail ile vesaire uğraşacağımı düşündüm. Devam edelim.
Scale up and down these image assets without any loss of quality. So that's really neat, and we only need to have this one size here. Okay, after you've done that, let's take a look at the UI that we're trying to build. Now, based on what you've learned in the previous lesson, how would you break this user interface up in terms of what view containers or layout containers, if you want to call them that, which one of those are you going to use to lay out these elements? And second of all, which view elements are you going to use to represent each of these things that you see? Now, as an exercise, I want you to pause this video and try building this UI yourself inside Xcode. Trust me, by doing this exercise, you are going to cement your skills and you're going to identify what you need to review. Now, before you start this challenge, if you haven't watched the previous lesson, you can do so right over there. It's going to show you all.
Tamam, deneyelim. Şimdi Content View'da yine burayı şu Day 2'dan kopyalayalım. Burada Ctrl A, Ctrl C yapacağım. Tamam. Şimdi tabi burada kamera diye bir görsel olmadığı için bunu yükleyemedi. Şu color'ı ne renk yapmamızı istiyor? Yeşil tonlarında bir renk yapmamızı istiyor. Bunun asset'i var mı acaba? Background. Şu background'u yapabiliriz sanırım. Background cloth. Deneyelim. Buraya image diyeceğim. Nasıldı? Küçük harflerle. Tamam. Şimdi en tepede bir V-stack'imiz olacak ve en tepede War adlı logo mu olması lazım? Aynen. Şimdi V-stack'imizi yapıyoruz. Buraya War'ı koyacağım. Sanırım. Bakalım. Ha, logoymuş adı. Pardon. War değilmiş. Ben biraz şu şekilde. Tabii. Önce bir silelim her şeyi. Şimdi oluşturalım kendimiz. Image diyeceğim. Logo diyeceğim. Tamam. Ardından 2 ve 3 numaralı kartları koyacağım ama bunları H-Stack'in içine koymam lazım. Card 2 ve Card 3 diye. I'yı da koyalım. Tamam. Şimdi sanırım şuralara spacer eklememiz gerekecek. Buraya da bir spacer ekleyeceğiz. Buraya da bir spacer ekleyeceğiz. Bu şekilde daha ortalara doğru duracak. Aynen. Bu arada bu sanırım plain olacak. Deneyelim. Aynen. Düz bir yeşil renk. Onun altında deal adlı buton mu olması lazım? Aynen. H-Stack'ten çıktım. Buraya yine image diyorum. Button diyorum. Tamam. Altına da player 0 ve CPU 0 denmiş. Yani text diyeceğim. Player diyorum. Tabii bu text bir H-Stack'in içinde olmalı çünkü yan tarafına bir text daha gelecek. Bunu da yapıştırdım. CPU diyorum. Bir saniye düşünüyorum. H-Stack'in içinde de bir V-Stack açacağım sanırım. Çünkü Mesela bunun altına bir şey daha koysam. Bunun altına gelecek. O player'ın altına 0 şeyinin gelmesini istiyorum. Şöyle 0 diyorum. Bu VStack'ten bir tane daha mı koymam lazım? Buraya da CPU mu yazmalıyım? Aynen. Tamam. Şimdi bu HStack'teki mi? Yoksa mesela bu HStack'e nokta desem color ile ilgili ne ekleyebilirim buraya? Foreground color nokta white desem textler white olacak mı? Oldu, evet. Tamam. Aynı zamanda textlerin fontunu ne yapmak istiyorum? Title yapmak istiyorum, evet. Şu VStack'lerin arasına da spacer'lar koymam gerekiyor sanırım. Yine şu şekilde. Ve en sona tamam. Hemen hemen aynı gibi duruyor. Sadece Z-Stay'in içine bir padding koyalım. Bakalım nasıl duracak. Padding'in ayarı nasıl yapılıyor? Tabii ondan çok haberim yok. Mesela burada nasıl yapmıştık? Mesela şuraya bir padding koysam ne olacak? Onu bir merak ettim. Tamam, bir şeyler ters gitti. Neyse, şu anlık bu kadar yapabildim sanırım. Bu padding olayını biraz daha öğrenmem gerekiyor. Tamam, devam edelim. Bakalım.
If you want to call them that, which one of those are you going to use to lay out these elements? And second of all, which view elements are you going to use to represent each of these things that you see? Now, as an exercise, I want you to pause this video and try building this UI yourself inside Xcode. Trust me, by doing this exercise, you are going for each of the elements that you see in the UI right here, I want you to just use a Swift UI view element to display the images that you've just come in handy. So pause the video now and try it out, and then resume it when you're ready to build it together. All right, how was it? Now, if you got it to look long, and then it's going to contain everything, all of the elements that you see on the screen. Inside that V stack, first we're going to have the logo centered, and then below the logo, we're going to have an H stack containing 2 cards, and then below the H stack, we are going to have the button, and then below that, we're going to have another H stack. Inside that H stack will contain 2 V stacks. Each of the V stacks will contain 2 text elements representing the player label as well as the score. And then it's just a matter of adding spacers and padding to make sure everything looks nice and spaced out. Now, if you did it another way, that's perfectly fine too. Okay, let's implement this in Xcode. Okay, so here back in Xcode, make sure you have all these image assets before. It's gonna be really simple, I promise you. But
ignore safe area yazmayı unuttum ve resizable yazmayı unuttum.
Naming the cards this way is gonna make it easier for us as well. Next up, we have, I'm just gonna use images for now for all of these elements. It's displaying the, it would go back to the add ignore safe, and then I'm going to do resizable. And you can see as soon as we do that, we're allowing Swift UI to resize that image to fit the screen, and you can see that it doesn't go past the safe area. So we're gonna have to add ignore safe area. Now for this type of background, it doesn't really matter even if it's way too large for the screen, because you can't really tell. But if it's a landscape image like we had for the Niagara Falls image in lesson 1, 2, 3, lesson 3, you would see that it's like super zoomed in, right? So that's why we would have to add the resizable. And then if you wanted to cover the whole screen, you would do ignore safe area. Okay, so that's that. This VStack next is going to contain all of our elements, like I said. First, and this time, instead of just adding padding, which does padding, remember, if you apply the modifier to a view container, it gets
Mesela şu an biraz daha aynı şeyleri yapmamıza rağmen sanırım bakıyorum. VStack'te spacer koymuş. Yani şuraya spacer koymuş mesela. Ardından bunun altına da spacer koymuş. Değil mi? Ondan sonra hashstack'ten sonra bir spacer daha koymuş. Her şey iki spacer'ın arasında yani. Şuraya da bir spacer gelecek. Bu şeyi böyle bu şekilde çözmüş yani. Bir saniye, bu spacer'ı şunların da altına koyalım. Tamam, aynen. Şu an birebir aynısını yaptık.
Evenly horizontally. Now we're going to do the same thing for the white, the font white. Now I could apply them to each text element, but remember, if you copy that, and I can paste it for this CPU. There you go.
Ben bu fontu daha çok sevdim. Biraz daha büyük olması daha iyi. Onun dışında sadece burada da aşağı doğru bir padding koyuyor. Bunu biz de yapalım. Mesela bunu yine VStack'in şeyi olarak yapsak, nokta padding desem, nokta bottom nasıl olmuş, sonra virgül 10. Yok, tam istediğim şey olmadı. Neden olmadı? Çünkü sadece ikinci VStack'in altına olmuş oldu. Şuraya yapsam yine bir şey değişmedi. Bunu direkt o zaman evet text'e, çünkü ben player'la sıfırın arasında bir padding koymak istiyorum. O yüzden player'la CPU text'lerine bu özelliği eklemem lazım. Tamam. Bütün hashtag eklersem hashtagg'in altına bir padding koyuyor. Hashtagg'in altında da herhangi bir şey olmadığı için bir şey etkilenmiyor. Anladım.
Awesome, that is our UI. Now, in order to apply some user interactivity to this button so that we can handle the user tapping on it, we're going to have to learn a little bit of basic Swift code. That's why we're going to take a few lessons to get some basic coding skills, and then we're going to come back to the war card game, apply what we've learned, and bring this app to life. Now, if this is going to be your first time coding, don't be intimidated. I'm going to make this so simple for you to understand, and we are going to erase any fears that you might have. If you're excited, please give this video a thumbs up if you haven't already. I really, really appreciate it. And I'll see you in the next lesson. In the last lesson, you built this user interface, but in order to handle taps on this button to change the cards up top, we're going to need a little bit of Swift code. By the end of this lesson, you'll be writing your own Swift code statements, and you'll realize that it's not so hard to read or write. So please watch until the end. All right, let's buckle up and let's go. First of all, let's make sure we're all on the same page. What is coding? Well, to me, it is just the act of writing out code statements which represent instructions that we want the computer to do. And then the computer reads the code statements and carries out our instructions. Well, what is Swift then? Well, Swift is the coding language that we use to write those code statements. Just like a language, for instance, English or Spanish has a structure and it has rules to follow and it allows us to express ourselves, the Swift coding language is the same. It has a structure and a grammar which we follow in order to write Swift code statements. These Swift code statements are then converted into machine code, which the computer can understand and carry out. Now, you might ask, why not just write machine code and skip this extra step? Well, Swift code is easy to read, write, and to manage for us human beings, but machine code is not. So that's why we need this step. Now, the thing that converts the high-level code, like Swift code, to machine code is called a compiler. In this case, with building iOS apps, Xcode performs this compilation step. Now that you understand what it is, let's try writing some Swift code statements of our own. And I know the perfect place to do this. We're going to experiment with some Swift code in something called Xcode Playgrounds. Now, if you're brand new to this video series, we downloaded and installed Xcode back in lesson 1. So if you don't have Xcode ready yet, just go ahead and watch lesson 1 right over there and come back to this lesson when you have Xcode ready to go. Now, a playground is a lightweight way for us to practice with and experiment with Swift code without creating a brand new app project, which has a ton of views already set up for you and things that we don't need. So here's how we can create our playground. Make sure that Xcode is in focus. You can click on Xcode, the dialog window right here, go up to File, and then go New and choose Playground. You're going to get something like this. Now we are going to go under iOS and we're going to choose blank, and that's going to be the most basic of basic playgrounds for us to test our code with. Dialog window right here, go up to File, and then go New and choose Playground. You're going to get something.
Buradan File, New ve Playground seçiyorum.
Like this. Now we are going to go under iOS and we're going to choose blank, and that's going to be the most basic of basic playgrounds for us to test our code with. Click on next, and we are going to save this somewhere. I'm just going to call this Swift code playground. You can call it whatever you'd like, as we're just going to use it to test some code. Okay, so now, first of all, I'm going to close this left-hand navigator because we don't need to test Swift code playground. You can call it whatever you'd like, as we're just going to use it to test some code. Okay, so now, first of all, I'm going to close this left-hand navigator because we don't need that by clicking that button. And then I'm going to make this window a little larger so we can see what we're working with. Okay, so if you're following along, you should have something that looks like this. Now in this brand new playground, we have this single Swift statement. You can ignore the import statement for now. Let's focus on this line of Swift code and let's see what that does. var greeting equals hello playground. Let's dissect this Swift statement. First of all, we're going to talk about this hello playground part on the right-hand side of the statement. Now, this is a piece of text data, and you've seen this before. In the user interface that you've previously built, I've highlighted the pieces of text data here. Now, it shouldn't really surprise you. Apps are all about manipulating data, pulling data from various sources, manipulating that data, showing that data to users through the app user interface, interacting, capturing user interaction as data, and then processing that, storing data and retrieving data to and from databases, and so on and so forth. Later on in this lesson, we're going to talk about different types of data that you can work with. But for now, let's go back to the code statement. This is a piece of text data. I want to ask you a question. Where does this piece of text data live? Or in other words, where does it exist? Well, it exists in the computer's memory. This is memory space that is allocated for our app to function. Okay, great. Now, how do we refer to this piece of data in the memory so that we can work with it and manipulate it? So walk with me through the scenario. Imagine you have your first Swift code statement that creates this piece of data in the computer's memory. In your second Swift code statement, let's say you want to work with this piece of data. Perhaps you want to manipulate that text data, change it to all capitals, or maybe you want to take it to display it on the user interface or something like that. But how do you retrieve it and access it from the computer's memory? We need some way to be able to access and reference that piece of data in memory. And this is where the rest of that Swift code statement comes in. Let's go back to it. This is a variable, and it is something that allows us to keep a reference to something else. Think about it like a sticky label that you can stick on a piece of data. In this case, our variable, or label if you want to think about it that way, is called greeting. And the equal sign is what is called an assignment operator. Now, its job is to assign the data on the right-hand side to the variable on the left-hand side. It's like the process of sticking that label onto that piece of data and giving to text a simple name. In this case, that is greeting. In fact, take a look at this second line. This code statement will run or execute the code to see what the results are or the output. So here in the lower left-hand corner, you'll find the small play button. And if you tap on that, it's going to execute the playground. Now, the first time you tap on it, you can check the status bar. It'll tell you it's running. And after you click it, you're going to see the output. Now, right here, you won't see anything aside from something appearing over there because we haven't printed anything out. But in the lower right-hand corner, you see this other button. This brings up this little window down here, and this is called the console area. This is where output will happen. So let's go ahead and write that second print statement and try out printing out our variable. So I'm going to type in print, open bracket, greeting. Remember, this variable is going to reference hello playground. So let me hit stop here and hit execute again. And this time it's going to run both lines of code starting from line 3 and then line 4. And you're going to see the result of line 4 printing out the text data into the console here. Now I want you to notice something. In line 3, we had the var keyword, but then in line 4, when we wanted to use that variable, we did not have to use the var keyword again, because remember, this var keyword is a special Swift keyword to create a new variable. In line 4, we're not creating a new variable. We are simply calling it and using the data that it references. That's why we don't use the var keyword there. Now, if you want to use proper terminology, this process of using the var keyword to create a new variable is actually called declaring a new variable. Now, I only use the word creating because in my experience teaching
Aslında şu anda kodlama kısmında basit bir giriş yapıyor. İşte burada bir değişken nasıl tanımlanır, değişken nasıl manipüle edilir, bunları vesaire gösterecek anladığım kadarıyla. Bu tarz yazımlara az çok aşinalığım var, o yüzden buraları biraz daha hızlı geçeceğim. Ancak şu anda çalışması biraz uzun sürdü. Nedenini anlayamadım. Alt üstü 3 satır kod yani. Ve şurası hala dönüyor. Sanırım şu an çalıştı. Devam edelim.
Teaching this, creating makes more sense to beginners. But now that I've explained this to you, I'm going to, first of all, let's talk about the string data type. This is what we've been working with so far. It's text data. I know that's a little bit of a weird term, but think of it as a string of characters. And in fact, this is the terminology for text data across most programming languages. So when you hear string, think of text. Next up, only store data of the same type that you declared for that variable. Now you might be thinking, looking at this playground, where have I declared any data types in these variable declarations? None of them have that colon data type. Well, what's happening here is a shorthand. I don't have to say what type of data it'll hold, but the system will look at what type of data I'm assigning to it, and then it's going to know, oh, okay, so this greeting variable is actually a string data type variable. This, my int, it looks at this data that I'm assigning to it, for the very first time, and it's going to know, oh, this is an int data type variable. So the same thing goes for the other variables. This is going to be a double. This is going to be bool. Now, why is this important to know? Well, let me show you an example. For this variable greeting, it is of the string data type, so I can assign these two pieces of string to it. In fact, I can reassign another piece of text data to it. However, let's say I try to assign an integer to it. We're going to, if we try to run this, we're going to get an error. Cannot assign value of type int, which is this, to type string, which is the greeting. Now, even if we do not declare the data type up here, so let me just get rid of that, and let me run it again, it will still end up with the same error, because the first time you assign data to that variable, you're locking in the type. It's going to look at this and it's going to say, this is string data type. This is going to be a string data type variable. And that's what it is from that point on. Okay. So
Yani aslında burada öncelikle şuraya bir geri gideyim. Şimdi bir declaration yaparken öncelikle işte var keyword'ünü yazıyoruz. Ardından variable'ın name'ini yazıyoruz. Bunu kendimiz belirliyoruz. Ardındansa burada datanın tipini yazıyoruz. Yani işte bir string mi, bir integer mi, bir double mı, bunu yazıyoruz. Bunun sebebi ise şu olabilir. Mesela örneğin siz kullanıcıdan bir input alacaksınız. Bu input'un bir integer olmasını istiyorsunuz. Örneğin kullanıcı yaşını girecek. Ancak yaşını bir sayı olarak almak istiyorsunuz. Örneğin kullanıcı 23 yazarsa harflerle bunu istemiyorsunuz. O yüzden burada var greeting yazıp ya da var işte age yazıp 2 nokta koyup integer, int keyword'ünü yazıyorsunuz ki kullanıcı bir yazı string tipinde bir input girmeye çalıştığında hata verecek. Bu tarz ayarlamaları yapmak için sanırım bu bu özelliği kullanabiliyoruz.
to know. Now, one last thing I want to show you before we move on from this lesson is something called a constant. Now, constants are a special type of variable. Instead of using the var keyword to declare a new variable, we use the let keyword to declare a new constant. Now, everything about a constant is the same as a variable, from how it's used to how it's declared and how it can only store data of the same data type as what you declare it with. Now, the only difference, there's one single difference, and that is that with a constant, you cannot reassign data to it. Once you assign data to it, it is constant, right? You're guaranteed that that is the piece of data that it's affixed to. Think of it as like a label, but instead of just sticking it on the piece of data, you are super gluing it on with some industrial grade stuff and you cannot rip it off. Okay, that is like a constant. So let's go back to the playground and let's try this out. So for example, if I change this var for the greeting variable to a let, that changes it to a constant. We're going to get an error here because we cannot assign a value. Greeting is a let constant. We've already assigned it this value, so we cannot reassign it. However, if I change my int to a let constant, this is going to be perfectly fine. I can run this, and it's going to produce output. However, if I try to reassign something to that label, let's say 40, we are going to get an error. Now, you might wonder, why would we ever want to use a let instead of a var? Well, the reason is that variables have special allowances in memory, some stuff under the hood that gives us this flexibility, but it comes at the cost of not being as efficient or optimized as a constant. So if you know something is not going to change, or you want the assurance that it will never change as you are using your constant, then you should use the let keyword. And in fact, Xcode will help you optimize this. If you use var,
Yani bir şeyin değişmeyeceğini biliyorsak ya da değişmemesini istiyorsak var keyword yerine let keyword'ünü kullanmak bize memory kısmında daha verimli bir kullanım sunuyor. Ancak işte bu tamamen kullanıcıya bırakılmış bir şey yine de.
use var keywords, and Xcode detects that, hey, you've never reassigned anything into this variable. Why not use a let? And it's going to prompt you, as you're coding in an actual app project, it's going to prompt you, why don't you change this var to a let instead? Because it's not going to impact anything. And in fact, under the hood, there's going to be a teensy bit of optimization.
Aynı zamanda Xcode'da eğer bir kodda siz eğer bir şeyi var olarak tanımlayıp değişken olarak tanımlayıp daha sonra hiç bir değişiklik yapmadıysanız bunu let olarak değiştirebileceğiniz uyarısını veriyormuş.
Congrats on writing your first Swift code statements. If you're learning a lot from this video series, please support me by giving this video a thumbs up. And if you're not shy, please drop a comment below and let me know whether or not you were able to follow along. This diagram sums up what you've learned today. You learned about what variables are, how to declare them, and how to use them. You learned about data types, and finally, you also learned about constants. Great progress today. We are going to continue learning Swift, and we're getting closer and closer to going back to that work hard game and adding user interaction. In this lesson, you learned about code statements. In the next lesson, we're going to learn how to batch these code statements up so that we can execute them as a group, so that we can assign that group to the button tap on the war card game. And that is how we are making our way towards adding interactivity to that war card game. I'll see you there. In the last lesson, you wrote your first Swift code statements. In this lesson, you're going to learn how to group together code statements to perform a task. Now, these groupings of code statements are called functions. This is a very powerful concept because you can execute or call these functions whenever you want to perform that task. Let's dive in and see how we can write our first function. Okay, so first of all, how do you declare a brand new function? Now, this is going to look somewhat similar to declaring a new variable or constant. It's a keyword followed by a name. So in this case of a function, the keyword to use is func, or func for short. And then followed by that, you put the name of the function. Now, just like a variable name, you are going to be referring to this function name in order to execute the contents of the function. Now, after the function name, you're going to have two rounded brackets. So we're going to ignore these for now, but these two brackets, they are part of the name. And then following that, you have a set of curly brackets. And you're going to find most of the time in Swift, when you see a pair of curly brackets, it's code that goes in between those two brackets. In this case of a function, that is where we are going to put our grouping of code statements. So whatever code statements you want this function to run when you call it, you are going to put those code statements in between those two curly brackets. Okay, so let's put some code in there and see what it looks like. You probably remember these two lines of code from the previous lesson. If we put those two lines of code into our function and we change the name to say hello, it's going to look like this. Okay, so how do we call this function so that we can execute its code? We simply use the function's name, say hello, followed by the two rounded brackets, because that is also part of the function's name. Notice that we don't need to use the func keyword again, because that was only for declaring a new function. So just like that, you are able to execute all of the code inside that function. Now, why don't we try it out in the Xcode playground so you can see it in action? So here I am with a brand new empty aside from the default code, Xcode playground. We have our var greeting equals hello playground string. And why don't we put in our second line, which is print greeting. And just like you saw in the previous lesson, when we run this, we are going to get that output in the playground right there. Now, let us declare a brand new function using the func keyword, followed by the function name, say hello, followed by two rounded brackets, followed by a pair of curly brackets. And oftentimes when you write these brackets, you'll find that Xcode helps you complete them. So let me just go back for a second by holding shift and hitting square bracket. So on my keyboard, that's how I get the, and it's unless we call the function. So if I start typing my function, this menu pops up. This is called an autocomplete menu, if I didn't mention that in the previous lesson. And this just helps you write code faster. The code is calling the function, which is executing the code in there. So you can see this is really powerful because oftentimes to perform a task, it's multiple lines of code working together to achieve a common result. And let's say there's 10, 20 lines of code. By putting it in a function, not only can you run that task whenever you want, but it also saves you from repeatedly writing the same code. And when you get to writing larger pieces of software, not repeating code is actually pretty important, because if you find an error in one instance of that repeated code, you don't have to go and fix it in all the other places you repeated that code. By putting it in a function once and calling it, from wherever you need to call it, you can edit the code and fix it from one place. Now that's pretty handy, right? If you like that, you'll be even more.
Aslında biraz bu kodlama, programlama işinde fonksiyonların nasıl kullanıldığını ve işlevinin ne olduğundan bahsetti. Şimdi fonksiyonların kullanım amacı dediği gibi bir tekrar etmeyi önlemek. Örneğin ben programımda kullanıcıya 10 kere merhaba demek istiyorsam, 10 kere bunu yazdırmak istiyorsam benim aynı print fonksiyonunu 10 kere alt alta yazmama gerek yok. Onun yerine, gerçi o başka bir loop'un konusu oluyor ama yani tekrar etmesini istemediğimiz bir olay dizisini biz bir fonksiyona yazarak sadece tek bir satırda çağırabiliyoruz. İşin özü bu aslında. Bu da nerede işimize yarayacak? Buradaki deal tuşuna bastığımızda, deal butonuna bastığımızda bir fonksiyon yazacağız. Ve bu tuşa her bastığımızda bu fonksiyon çalışacak. Biz orada ekstra tekrardan bütün fonksiyonun içerisindeki gerçekleşecek eylemleri, olayları yazmamıza gerek kalmayacak aslında. Ve aynı zamanda biraz da kodun daha temiz görünmesine sebep olacak. Bu da tabii ki kodlarken, programlarken göz önüne almamız gereken bir şey.
More impressed with this next part. Now, to take it a step further, functions can be even more useful because they can accept input into the function when you call it. And that is what the two rounded brackets is for. That comes after the function name. In between those two rounded brackets, you can put a series of what looks like variable declarations. If you take a look at this slide here, in between the two rounded brackets, I have m:string. Now, what this is doing is declaring what's called a parameter for the function. This means that whenever I call the say hello function, I also need to supply the function a piece of string data. And then inside my function, within the two curly brackets, I can work with that piece of data, and I can reference that piece of data using the parameter name, which in this case is m. So you can imagine with this code now, whenever the say hello function is called, it also needs to be supplied with a piece of string data, which we can reference using m. And then within the function, we have the code print m. So in essence, this function serves the purpose of outputting or printing to the console whatever piece of string data you pass to the function. So let's try that out in the playground here. So instead of saying var greeting, I'm going to erase that line right there. And I'm going to declare a parameter of my function. Let's use m:string. This pretty much is a variable declaration, right? Except without the var keyword. But the proper terminology is this is a parameter of the function. You can only use m inside these two curly brackets. So we also need to modify our code here because there's no concept of what is a greeting now because we just deleted that variable. So let's print out m. And now you can see when we make these function calls, say hello, Xcode recognizes that, hey, if you were to call this function the way that you declared it, you need to supply a piece of string data. So it's saying it's missing the argument for parameter m in the call. So let's take a look at what that looks like. I'm going to erase those two function calls and I'm going to type it out again. Now, notice this time, autocomplete detects that you need to supply string data, and this is what that looks like. So I'm going to press enter, and this is where I would supply that piece of string data. And notice that it tells you that this is going to be the parameter name. When you're building this for real, you would probably use a more descriptive parameter name than just m. So you might say message, for example, and it would make more sense as you're supplying the string data. But we'll leave it as m because to follow the example in the slide, I'm going to say I can code functions. Okay, let's run the code and see what happens. So as we expect, it prints out I can code functions because this piece of string data is being passed into the function as a parameter, and it can be referenced by this parameter label m, and then I am printing it out right there. I have a reference to m from within the curly brackets, but outside of the function declaration, it doesn't know what m is.
Ya burada fonksiyonlara şöyle biraz yakınlaşayım. Bir fonksiyon tanımlarken direkt bu parantez içinde variable tanımlarını yapabileceğimizden bahsediyor. Örneğin biz yeni bir fonksiyon yazarsak add together olsun adı da. İki tane input alsın. Birisi a integer, diğeri b. Sanırım arada virgül olması gerekiyor. Integer. Şuradan çıktım. Şunu açtım. Buraya da print. Private değil, print a artı b dersem mesela add together fonksiyonunu çağırırken mesela videoda da olduğu gibi a2 nokta b2 nokta diye bana hazır bir şey veriyor. Ben buraya mesela 5 ve 4 yazarsam sonuç olarak 9 görmeyi bekliyorum. Bakalım. Hello 9. Evet. İşte burada fonksiyonların güzel özelliği ise yani ben burada her farklı sayı kombinasyonu için print a artı b yazmıyorum. Ben sadece geliyorum, atıyorum 9 ve 3 yazıyorum. 12 görüyorum. 15 ile 4 yazıyorum. 19 görüyorum. Vesaire. Burada kodu sürekli yazmama gerek kalmıyor. Ben sadece girmek istediğim inputları girerek tekrar edecek kod işlemin sonucunu görebiliyorum.
Right. If I try to print m like that, it cannot find m in this scope. This is called a scope. So you can think of the area between these two curly brackets as a standalone scope or standalone area, and only in that area does this parameter exist in there that you can reference it using m. Now going back to our diagrams for a section, what does it look like to have multiple parameters for a function? Because oftentimes we may require multiple inputs. All it is simply is you declare your parameters separated by a comma. In this example, we have the same m parameter followed by a comma and then an n parameter. Notice all this out. Does addition. And you haven't seen addition yet, so this will be interesting. So let's declare in this. This function do add and Xcode. Now let us go back to the slides and extend it even more. Now functions can be made even better because functions have the ability to return output when you call them. Let's take a look at how this looks like. If you look at this syntax, notice that after the function name, after the rounded brackets, we have a dash followed by a greater than sign, which makes it look like an arrow, right? In fact, that is to signify that this function returns something, like it produces some sort of output. And then followed by that makeshift arrow, we have the data type of the data that this function produces. In this case, I'm going to put int because I want to return or output a sum. And then within the curly brackets of the function, you have to make sure that you have the return keyword, because if you've specified that this function is going to produce some sort of output, then you have to use that return keyword and actually produce the output that this function returns. And you also have to make sure that what you are returning, the output data, matches the data type that you have said this function will return. In this case, I've indicated that doAdd will return an int data, and inside the body of my function, I'm returning a piece of int data. So all is well. Now, before we go into Xcode Playgrounds to try this out, let's combine this with input parameters and see what that looks like. So if you take a look at this slide, I have two input parameters, A and B. They're both integer types. They're separated by a comma in this parameter list. And then after the rounded brackets, I have that arrow, and I am specifying that I'm going to be returning an int data. In the body of my function, I am adding up the two inputs into a variable called sum. And then I have the return keyword, and I'm returning that sum as an output of the function. Let's take a look at this in action in our playground. So let's mod.
Şimdi burada eğer biz bir return almak istiyorsak, yani ben şunu yazdığımda bir return gelsin istiyorsam buradaki işlemimi bir variable'da kaydetmem gerekiyor. Buna da a artı b diyeceğiz. Sonra da return sum diyeceğim. Bu şekilde yaparsak bir saniye. Niye şey olmadı ya? Bu şekilde yaparsak
Let's modify our doAdd
sonucu kodumuza return edebiliyoruz.
function here. I'm going to put a space after the rounded brackets. I am going to hit dash greater than space, and then I'm going to say that this returns int data. Now, Xcode is going to complain here because it detects that I've indicated I should return int data, but I'm missing the return keyword for an expected int data. So instead of printing this out, I'm actually going to say return sum, just like in our slides. Now let's run this code and see what happens. Notice here that I am calling that doAdd function, and I'm passing in 2 and 3 as my input parameters. Now there is no output. Nothing pops out in the console. Why is that? Because we don't actually have a print statement that outputs it to the console. Now you might argue, but we're returning the data from here. Well, returning the data doesn't mean printing it out. Returning the data means that this function produces that output. But where does it go? Well, what we have to do is we have to declare either a constant or variable to refer to that output. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to declare a constant this time. I'm going to say let result equals the output of doAdd. Right? So what's
Ya burada aslında return'ün yaptığı şey bir output dönmek. Ancak bu output'u görmemiz için bizim bu fonksiyonun sonucunu bir yere kaydetmemiz gerekiyor. Bunu işte ya bir değişkende ya da bir constant parametrede kaydedebiliyoruz. Örneğin ben burada result'a videoda da yapıldığı gibi result parametresine kaydedersem ve bu result'ı yazdırırsam o zaman
so what's going to happen here
sonucu görebiliriz.
when I execute this function and it produces that sum and it returns it, that output is going to get assigned to my constant result. If I run it right now, there also is no output. Well, why is that? Because in this line of code, I've merely kept track of the sum. So now I can refer to that piece of data. I still, at the end of the day, need to print it out. So I'm going to write print result here. Now I did this so I can illustrate to you how it's different printing it inside the function versus returning it out of the function and then capturing a reference to it with a constant or a variable and then working with it. Now, you might say that's redundant. I could have printed it inside the function, and that's true. But I mean, this is a really small scenario, right? This is important because sometimes you may need the output to further work with it, maybe you might want to pass that result into a second function. You might want to work with it in some way, not just simply print it out, right? With the ability to take input and to produce output, functions.
Yani aslında burada direkt fonksiyonun içinde bir print statement kullanmak yerine return kullanarak aslında bu fonksiyonun ürettiği output'u, fonksiyonun üreteceği çıktıyı biz tekrardan ekstra bir modifikasyona sokabiliyoruz. Burada gelen output'u tekrardan bir şeylerle işleyebiliyoruz. Bize bu imkanı sunuyor return kullanarak bu datayı farklı bir değişkende kaydetmek.
Functions can truly live up to their name and help us group together sets of instructions. Now, there are a couple more things I want to show you about functions before we are done with them. One is called a parameter label. So when we declared parameters here for our doAdd function, what we could have also done right before the parameter name, you can put a label. So you can say let's say first num, and before parameter b, you could do the same thing. You could put another label, second num. Let's take a look at what that does to our function call. Now I am going to erase this line of code here, and we're going to type do add. And this time, take a look at what autocomplete suggests for us. It is now using the parameter labels instead of the actual parameter names. It functionally, the function works exactly the same way. So if I put 3 and 8 here, and then I run the function, it's going to output 8. The only difference now is by putting these parameter labels in front of the parameter names, it is going to change how you call the function. The reason for doing this, there may be multiple reasons, right? One could be you want words that are more descriptive so that when you're calling your function, you remember what data you are supplying for it. This also allows you to, notice inside your function, you are still referencing them by the parameter names itself. So that's something you can use to make your functions a little more intuitive as you're reading them and using them. Something else you can do is if you don't want to have these at all, right? If you don't want to put labels or parameter names at all, you can replace your parameter labels with a simple underscore. You can do this with one, you can do this with both, it doesn't matter. Let me just do it for both and show you what that looks like. So I'm going to type do add again, and this time take a look at what it shows up as. So you'll still see that parameter name here, but you're now adding your data. Notice that you don't see any parameter names in the function call. You also don't see any parameter labels in the function call. So this might be good for very intuitive function names. So do add, pass in 2 numbers, very obvious what that's going to do. Or it could be to shorten the function calls itself, or things like that. And the last thing I want to mention to you is what is a function signature? And just like a written signature, a function signature is used to identify a function. And that consists of the function name as well as its parameter list, including argument labels and such. It may seem pretty obvious, but let me introduce a scenario to you. So if I have another function called do add, and this is going to be that, right? And maybe this is, I don't know, maybe a plus b plus b, and then return the sum. So obviously the calculations are a little bit different, like what each function does, but they're both called do add, and they both have parameters a and b. So what is the function signature? Well, the function signature of this one up here, do add, is that, and the function signature of this one is this, right? Like this one is this, and this one is this. So they're different, and it is a combination of function name, like how you are using those parameter labels, plus the parameter names itself, if that is even a factor. Now, in terms of the topics covered today, I would say declaring functions, function inputs and outputs are the most important thing. Parameter labels and function signatures are nice to know, especially when you get to reading Swift code and you won't get confused about why some things look the way that they do. But yeah, all of that combined is a good working knowledge of Swift functions. I hope.
Anladım. Yani eğer biz şuradan biraz geri geleyim. Biz aynı parametreleri ve aynı çıktığı veriyor olabiliriz. Daha doğrusu aynı çıktı olmuyor. Aynı parametreleri kullanıp bu parametreleri farklı bir şekilde işliyor olabiliriz bir fonksiyonda. Yani burada iki fonksiyon da a ve b değişkenlerini alıyor integer olarak. Ve yine içerisinde a ve b'yi kullanıyor. Ekstra bir şey yok. Ancak bunların signature'ları, imzaları farklı tamamen. Bu aslında işte yine kompleks uygulamalarda kullanılan bir şey olabilir. Belki bazı fonksiyonların daha kısa bir ismi olması isteniyordur. Aynı inputları kullansalar bile bazı fonksiyonların signature'ları farklı olabilir. Onun dışında işte kısaca burada fonksiyonları gördük. Fonksiyonların nasıl kullanıldığını, ne amaçlara hizmet ettiğini ve işte burada fonksiyonları kullanırken neleri değiştirebileceğimizi vesaire gördük. Bunun dışında bir de böyle bir layout yaptık yine. Layout'u yapması gayet kolaydı aslında. Kısa sürdü ve zevkliydi. Logoları vesaire asset kısmını hallettikten sonra sadece layout'u dizmek kalıyor aslında geriye. Bu da aslında gayet kolayca anlaşılabilecek bir şekilde yapılabiliyor. Evet, bugün bunları gördük. Bir sonraki gün 4'te Lesson 7'yi ve Lesson 8'i de izleyip bitirmeyi hedefliyorum. Yani 8 günlük bu kursu 4 günde bitirmiş olmayı umuyorum. Bugünlük bu kadardı tekrardan. Görüşmek üzere. İzlediğiniz için teşekkürler.